Good afternoon. My name is James Preston Allen, and this is Random Links News interview section with Jeffrey Prang, the LA County Assessor for the County of Los Angeles. And just to be clear, the County Assessor does not collect the taxes. He just tells us how much all the property is valued at, and does a whole lot of other things. So today we're going to talk with him about what's been going on with the increased values of property tax in Los Angeles County, which over the past decade seems to have gained somewhat $900 billion in value over the course of one decade.
That's right.
Which is probably an unprecedented increase.
Almost double what it was 10 years ago. We just closed the what we call the annual assessment roll on June 30th, and the total value of assessed value of all property in LA County is about $2 trillion. A decade ago was about just over $1 trillion. So it's a huge amount of growth in a very short period of time.
So tell the audience about what you did prior to being the county assessor.
So I've been assessor. I was first elected in 2014. Prior to that, I served as on the city council in West Hollywood for almost 18 years. I served as mayor 4 times, but I've also been working in the public sector most of my adult life. I was a city administrator. I worked in LA County for a number of years with the sheriff's department. Actually began my career in government working for the assessor as a staff assistant 30 years ago. Spent a number of years at the city of Los Angeles working for the city council, and then later at the Department of Animal Services. And
so you never decided to go off and be in the military and fight in wars and any of that?
I was the closest I came is the governor of Kentucky made me a Kentucky colonel. It has nothing to do with chicken.
That's right. That's right. So, what does it take to be an assessor? I mean, you must have some kind of affinity for dealing with numbers. And
I always tell people, ask you how do you get to be assessor, and I say you get the most votes,
right,
in an election. But so the assessor is not. It's not a fiscal office, and that's probably one of the more common misconceptions. The principal job of the assessor's office is real estate appraisal.
Right.
So I guess you have to have a couple of skills. You have to have some spatial awareness skills. You probably need to be able to do math that's involved in determining the values. Many assessors in the 58 counties in California spent their entire career in the assessor's office. I did not. I'm not a career appraiser. I've been more of a career public administrator. And so in my day-to-day job, I've got 1,300 people in my department. We're the largest department of our kind in the United States. I am personally not involved in doing real estate appraisal. That is not part of my day-to-day function. I have 700 real estate appraisers who do that. My job is to manage the department. I focus on budget, on personnel, on providing the resources to do our job, on legislation and policy advocacy, working with my colleagues throughout the state to ensure that we can standardize our policy and practices, to improve our technology systems, to provide better service. So while those assessors, particularly in smaller counties where they actually spent their whole life as an appraiser, they're probably a little bit more numerically inclined than I am.
Right. So what's the biggest challenge for the county assessor of Los Angeles? I mean, we are, in many respects, the most populous county in the nation.
We are the most populous county in the nation.
And we have, is the assessed value of the property the largest in the nation?
It's the largest in the nation, and my department is more than double the size of the next largest. Even Cook County in Chicago has about 300 or 400 employees. We have 1,300 employees.
So managing 1,300 employees has got to be just a job in and of itself. And the question is that I would imagine that the biggest complaints you get from the taxpayers is, are there enough assessors to do the job in a effective way?
Well, I think if you talk to any government manager, they will tell you they don't have enough personnel to do the job, and it is very difficult to keep sufficient numbers of people to do the work that we have. In our department, about 1,300 employees, about half of them are real estate appraisers or personal property appraisers. We do a really good job getting the job done because we're kind of fiscal year. We have to count everything and roll all the value of properties within that 12-month period. Candidly, I don't have enough people to get it all done.
So there are how many pieces of real estate in LA County? Just
to give you a little bit of idea about the gravity of our job in LA County, there's about 2.3 million real property parcels, about 200,000 to 300,000 business assessments, and then there's personal property, including aircraft, boats, mobile homes, et cetera, that are all part of the assessment role. We only do our job, we only reappraise property upon a change in ownership, like a sale, or the death of a property owner, or when there's new construction. So we're not reassessing all the property in the county annually, just those transactions.
And so but there is because of Prop 13, an annual increase of what?
2% maximum.
2% maximum. And what determines whether it's 1.5 or 2 in a given year?
That number is determined by the State Board of Equalization, and they look at a number of economic indices. For example, in the first year of COVID, property values were only adjusted upward 1% as opposed to 2% because of the falling economic conditions. Even though property values were going up rather precipitously during COVID, especially single-family homes, the overall economy was strained and didn't support 2%.
Right. So before we went on air, you were talking about usury possessory tax.
Possessory interest.
Yeah. And our readers might understand that in the context of the fact that we have a very large piece of property in Council District 15 called the Port of Los Angeles.
That's where the boats are, right?
That's where the boats are. That's a piece of property that is owned by the state of California, and then by statute is allowed to be operated by the city. And then the city leases out significant portions of that to private companies and corporations. And those private entities pay a
possessory interest
tax. And it's based upon what?
So we don't tax government-owned property, except when government-owned property is being used by private entities for private purposes. So we determine the operative approach to evaluating property's value is market value. What is that property worth on the open market? We apply restrictions. There are government restrictions which limit what it could do. Zoning may have an impact on it, but market value is always the standard of how we value property. And then in the case of the port, once we've determined what that value is, if there's a shipping company that uses, let's say they use 5 acres out of 10 acres, then we will apportion it to that piece that they actually are using for their private benefit, and they will be responsible for the taxes that otherwise would be exempt for the government.
So here's a little something that's always made me curious. So oftentimes corporations that have a long-term lease with the Port of Los Angeles sell or merge to another corporation.
Right.
And I don't believe that necessarily triggers a reassessment in the same way that when Union Oil sold their refinery to ConocoPhillips, you would think that the sale of the refinery would trigger that kind of assessment because it's basically a transfer of property, but it doesn't. And this is true for many different properties that are held by corporations. When the corporation buys another corporation, it's part of the assets, but it doesn't trigger a reassessment. And so the people and the county, the people of the county and the state are actually being shortchanged by these corporate sales.
That's correct. Under California law, in order for a sale or a transfer of property to cause a reassessment, 50% ownership has to change. So this is actually a loophole that really only benefits corporate entities, where they will transfer less than 50%, sometimes over a period of time, and not trigger a reassessment so they can keep their property taxes low. There's a really good example I wanted to call your attention that was a subject of a court case that before I was elected, went all the way to California Supreme Court. But there was the owner of Dell Computers, Mr. Dell, wanted to buy the hotel in Santa Monica called the Fairmont. And forgive me, my numbers may be wrong, but just to give you a rough idea of the gravity, I think that hotel was assessed at somewhere around $80 million.
Right.
The new value, the market value of that hotel was probably closer to $250 million. And that would have been almost a 3-time increase in property taxes. So instead of purchasing the property, taking full ownership, he assembled a limited liability corporation where he and members of his family each owned a minority share. And then that LLC purchased the hotel, but because no one individual or entity got 50% ownership, it was not considered to be a transfer. Even though 100% control of that hotel changed, the law determined that 50% ownership did not change, and thus it was not reassessable. That is an inequitable part of the system that really needs to be changed. Even the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, which are the defenders of Prop 13, have indicated that Prop 13 was not intended to create strategies to evade taxation. It was intended to stabilize taxation.
Right.
And this is something that is not in Prop 13. This 50% rule is done by statute. So they can pass a law that says that those properties can be reassessed. But
they haven't been able to do it.
They've not been able to do it.
And why do you think that's so?
So I've heard a couple different reasons. Probably the one that seems most plausible to me is that a lot of advocates who in favor of reforming Prop 13 don't want to do things piecemeal. They want the whole thing to go away, and they're afraid that if they just take little pieces of it to try to fix those broken pieces, that they will lose their momentum toward greater reform. I don't think I agree with that. I've been in government now most of my adult life, and I've learned that sometimes incremental approaches to change may not be very satisfying, but sometimes that's the best way to...
But they're more pragmatic.
Right. So I think here's one of the challenges with proponents and opponents of Prop 13 is it's so polarized, it's almost impossible to have a rational conversation about it.
To have consensus even at the legislative level.
But there is consensus that this legal corporate loophole, which allows them to transfer property without being reassessed, there's very few people who think that's a fair and equitable system.
Right.
And if we can agree in Sacramento that there is a solution to that and address it, maybe we can look at other elements of the law that might also need to be looked at. We just need to have all sides recognize that no law is perfect, that there's a lot of things that can and should be changed. But as long as it's a zero-sum game, it's going to be hard to make that sort of improvement.
Right. So the thing is that the basis for Prop 13, I believe, but particularly amongst people who own property is widely supported.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it benefits when you buy a piece of property. It's assessed at your purchase price, and it goes up in a reasonable manner. And so there's no like wild swings because of the market value every year. And for your office, if you had to reassess every single property in LA County because the market is going through the roof or goes into the toilet, that would be an impossible job.
It'd be very difficult. Other states, the way they do it is that they don't really assess property on an individual basis. They apply a rate of change, either increase or decrease, broadly to all properties in a certain geographic area. They may say that we're going to tax property at 70% of market, and this year we believe the market went up 5%, so everybody gets a 5% increase.
So, regardless of whether you live in the blue blood section of town or you live across the tracks,
and they may do it differently by different neighborhoods based on where they think property values are growing in that area. But in California, under Prop 13, we assess properties individually upon reassessment, and each one is done based on its own unique characteristics.
Right. And in some states, I believe Montana, they either have a very low or zero sales tax,
right,
and everything is loaded onto the property tax roll.
I believe that's the same thing in Texas as well. There's sometimes we hear discussions about how Texas is much more friendly on a tax basis. On some taxes it is, but property taxes, it's not. Property taxes in California are stabilized under Prop 13. The day that you buy your property, you pretty much know what your taxes are going to be every year for as long as you own that property.
Right.
Just assume it's going to be a 2% increase, and you can carry that through for the next 30 years.
So while we're talking about state legislation and property tax initiatives, there was a proposition on the ballot a few years ago called Proposition 19,
right,
which the intention of it, I think, was good, but it also affects smaller family-owned pieces of property in terms of inheritance. Can you explain that to our audience?
So Prop 19 was adopted in November of 2020, and I will tell you candidly, it was a dumpster fire. Absolute crappy piece of legislation. Rushed through the legislature in the last week of the legislative session. They didn't do their due diligence. They didn't vet it through a committee, through experts. Assessors, who are the ones who are responsible for administering it, were not really consulted during this deliberation. And when it was adopted in November 2020, my office spent the next couple of months just trying to dissect it to find out what we could and could not do to implement it. The legislature gave us 2 months to put it into effect. I can tell you that we could not have done it in less than 12 months. 18 to 24 months was much more realistic because it totally changed the way we operate. It didn't give us any resources in terms of personnel or money, even though it changed the way that our operation works.
So
So let me tell you what Prop 19 does.
Yes.
It does two things. One is, I think a lot of people would think is beneficial. It allows seniors who are over the age of 55, the disabled, and people who are victims of a natural disaster like a flood or earthquake to transfer their property taxes when they sell their home and buy a new one.
Right.
So if you've owned your home since 1990 and have a relatively low tax base, you can buy a new house and take that tax base with you. So you're not going to be paying new taxes in your new, more expensive home.
Right.
It allows you to move anywhere in the state of California to buy a home of any value and to transfer that tax base 3 times, or if you're married, 6 times. So your tax base becomes portable. Especially for seniors, you want that sort of stability. The challenge with that is you lose revenue by stabilizing those taxes. So local government was very concerned. So what the authors did to compensate, and they didn't talk about this very publicly because it's not very popular, but they eviscerated family inheritance benefits. So under the old law, if you were a parent and you want to leave your property to your children, you can leave them your home and up to $1 million in other property without being reassessed, so your kids wouldn't have a tax increase. Prop 19 rolled a lot of that back. Under Prop 19, the only property that your children can inherit without reassessment is your primary residence. And then there's some conditions to that. So for them to inherit your home and the tax base, one, they have to move into that house within 12 months, and they have to file the homeowner's exemption, and they have to, as long as they want that tax base to continue, they must live there in perpetuity. Secondly, it puts a cap on how much value of that home can be transferred to the children and be exempt from taxes, or to transfer the old tax base. The rule of thumb is that if the house is worth less than $1 million, you will inherit that home and your taxes will remain the same. If it's over $1 million, and the median sales price of a single-family home in LA County is about $900,000, so it's about half the properties in the county, the value over $1 million will be assessed at market value, so you'll get a blended rate.
Right.
First $1 million, you'll inherit your parents' rate. Over $1 million, you'll get a market rate.
Right.
And for those people who inherit a parent's home and don't plan to live in it, that home will be reassessed to market rate, which may cause them to have to sell the property. So,
and that's the concern.
There's a lot of people.
Right.
A lot of the concerns that I've heard, and I've heard this from thousands of people, is that, hey, we're just working people. We own a home, we have a rental property, and we leave something to our kids. But the taxes based on property values in California today might make it impossible for them to keep the cherished family home.
Keep the properties as a whole. Now, one of the other purposes was to challenge the inheritance of people who had properties that were worth more than what, $10 million?
Yeah, there was an example that made a front page of the LA Times a couple of years ago. The family of Lloyd Bridges, the actor,
right,
who lived in Malibu. When he died, he had owned a home in Malibu for decades.
Right.
When he died, his sons, the actors Bo and
the other one,
Bridges, inherited that property, but they chose not to live in it. They leased it on, I guess, an Airbnb for something like $10,000 to $20,000 a month. And there was a sense that these super rich people owning this super valuable piece of property and making all types of untaxable money off that property and revenue didn't seem equitable. It didn't seem consistent with the intent of Prop 13. And I think most fair-minded people would probably agree with that. But Prop 19 probably needed to come in with a scalpel to address that sort of scenario. Most people inheriting property are just inheriting their family property. They're just average working people who their parents may have invested in this property, and this may be the nest egg that they want to leave behind so that their kids can begin to climb the economic ladder.
Yeah.
And so
it's generational transfer of wealth.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And the Prop 19 actually artificially stems some of that artificial or that intergenerational transfer of wealth.
Yes, it does. It puts a big damper on that, and it's caused a lot of consternation with the public. Actually, I believe strongly that if the public was aware of the trade-off of Prop 19, which only passed by a very narrow margin,
right,
I don't think it would have passed. I think seniors want to have that benefit of being able to transfer the tax base. I don't think they necessarily want to do that at the expense of their children's inheritance.
And I think that the grandma caveat of that law is what people voted for.
Yes.
And they didn't understand the other.
It's what I have always said since I've had this job is when you're dealing with complex property tax administrative issues, they don't really lend themselves well to ballot measures.
Right.
They're extremely complicated. This one was very, very complex. Even assessors who do it for a living have had a very difficult time with it. How can we expect the average voter to really make a thoughtful and informed choice about something like this, particularly with the limited amount of information they were provided?
And then how would that law be amended at this point?
So It's like any other constitutional amendment voted on by the people. It can only be amended by another vote of the people. There is an effort right now by the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association to repeal the family inheritance portion of Prop 19 and to restore the previous law, which was called Proposition 58. And they're collecting signatures. I haven't heard any update on that. I do believe if they get it on the ballot, it'll win.
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen them over at the local grocery store standing outside collecting signatures for this yet, but yeah. So your latest press release announces that the LA County property values are nearly $2 trillion a year now.
That's the total. It's not property tax values. That's the property assessed value of property.
Assessed value.
$2 trillion.
It's not what gets collected.
Yeah, the total collections are about $24 billion off of that number. The total value of the assessment roll grew about $111 billion last year, about 5.9% growth. And that 5.9 is a pretty respectable number,
right?
Particularly given so much uncertainty in the real estate market. But during COVID, where we had this expectation that the economy was going to absolutely tank, and it did in some ways, but not in the real estate industry. Low mortgage rates and the limited inventory actually saw single-family homes and condominiums skyrocket.
Right.
In some cases, as much as 20% in 1 year.
Right.
And that has not really abated. While there has been a slight correction, some median sales prices have dropped modestly, but they're still all higher than they were before COVID. Right now in LA County, there's about 50 cities and communities where the median sales price is $1 million.
Yeah.
The places where we saw the biggest impact by COVID was commercial property, and the one kind of the dark cloud going forward is commercial office space downtown LA, where some companies, due to COVID, have incorporated a telework environment. They don't want as large of a footprint. They don't need as many people. They don't want to pay as much. So we are seeing, it's possible we could actually see a reduction in the assessed value of some commercial properties in the next year. But we do expect that next year, that property values county-wide overall will see positive growth.
Yeah. So what do you do? You don't collect the money. You just are the assessor for the city, for the county, and as I recall, the money actually ends up going to the state and then returned back to the local entities.
That's not correct. Maybe I should just give a little primer on how that system works. So there's actually multiple departments that each have a different piece of the property tax administrative system. So the way it works is when you buy a house, you record a deed with the registrar recorder. Or if you do new construction, you pull a permit with the city. The recorder and the cities send us those deeds and permits, and then my appraisers determine the market value of that property. We then turn that data over to the auditor controller department, and they're the ones who assign all the tax rates, put the special assessments and bond indebtedness costs, et cetera. They then turn it over to the treasurer tax collector. They send out the bills and collect the payments. So I always like to say that the guy who collects taxes has a very intuitive title. He's called the tax collector. So he collects the money, and then the money is then given to the auditor, who then distributes it to what they call participating agencies, which are cities, school districts, special districts. But every dollar that is collected in property taxes, 40 cents on that dollar goes to schools, about 20 to 25 cents goes to LA County government. Depending on the city that you live in, it could be anywhere as low as 4% or as high as 25%. Special districts and local, what they call successor agencies, redevelopment agencies.
So a school district is on the tax thing.
Yes.
We have things like flood control districts, and we have vector control for pests, mosquitoes, and all that.
They've got their own line item on the tax bill.
Right. exactly. That's what I'm saying. That,
Yeah.
that outside of the basic tax bill, because it can be a little confusing when they start adding up all of the special districts and whatnot along with the tax.
This is actually it's an interesting issue that you raise. And sometimes it's a point of frustration for me and my colleagues. I wish they would change the name of the tax bill to the consolidated tax bill, because your property tax bill is not just your property taxes. There's a long list of items on there. Only one of them is property taxes. It's the first one.
Right.
But the rest of them, they have the word assessment in it. But those are taxes that are assigned to your property, but they're not the taxes on your property.
Right.
So the only one that relates to me and my job is the very first one on that list. The rest of them may be roads, schools, vector control, stormwater, transportation.
And who you're saying that there's an auditor that
yes.
divides it up, and each of those separate districts has their own bank account?
Yes, each of those are a separate government entity. For example, something most people are not even aware of, vector control. That is a government agency run by government employees. They're not part of the city, they're not part of the county, they are their own government entity. And they have the authority to put something on the tax bill to fund it.
Right.
And so when the auditor assigns that rate to each taxpayer, the money is collected, they write a check to the vector control who uses it for their purpose.
Yes.
It is, but it's very common for us to get a call from somebody saying, you raised my property taxes by like 30% last year.
Mm-hmm.
And as we talked about several times already, we don't. Your taxes never go up more than 2%.
Right.
But if you get a property tax bill that goes up 30%, it's not the taxes on your property that went up. It's one of those other taxes. One you may have voted on, one
right.
school board may have voted on, but they're not related to
right.
the tax on your actual property.
Mm-hmm. So compare the Long Beach, San Pedro Harbor area in terms of escalation of property value versus the west side.
I don't know that I can off the cuff compare those. I can tell you that the property values on the west side are always the strongest performing, and even during the recession in 2008, 2009, those properties really didn't lose value. They may have stabilized, but countywide, about 500,000 properties actually were worth less than what the owner had paid for it. The west side was relatively insulated.
And if you feel like your property has been, the taxes have been increased, more than allowed, what's the remedy for that?
You can appeal it. So if you think your taxes are too high, what you're really saying is, I think my house is overassessed.
Right.
And you have the right to challenge that. And there's a couple ways to do it. The first thing you do is administratively, just call us and say, hey, you have my house recorded at a certain value. I think that's wrong. Here's some comparable sales. It says that you're wrong. And if we agree with you, we'll lower it.
Right.
But the next thing you would do is you'd file an appeal.
Right.
And you would go before a hearing officer. Mm-hmm. And the hearing officer, it's kind of like a courtroom, and a hearing officer sits across, and an appraiser will defend the value that they came up with, and you or your representative will argue why you think they're wrong. Right. And if you succeed, they will lower the value.
Getting back to the local property values, in the LA County as a whole, again, it was between 2012 and 2023, $917 billion of value, which was an 85%, according to this memo I got from your office,
right?
Which I presume is accurate.
I would assume so.
So there was a net growth of 85% in value. My only question is whether or not the the crisis, the housing crisis, is in some way not really solving the homeless crisis, but is in fact being used as a means of creating more tax base. Because, you know, when you either rehab an old building or you build new, you immediately get into the realm of triggering a reassessment, right?
Yes, but that is the reassessment of property upon a transfer or new construction is really incidental. It's not it's not a revenue generating plan. It's just how the law works. That when you change the property, it gets you do by adding new construction or by selling it, it gets reassessed. I think that the housing and the real estate market is having a profound impact on housing because housing here is so expensive that fewer and fewer people are within the realm of affordability, and it's pushing them into housing insecurity and homelessness. It's not getting better. In some ways, we kind of celebrate the fact of how much property value is growing and how much revenue it's generating for government. At the same time, it's also costing us a great deal more because people at the bottom economic rungs are now needing more and more services from government because they're losing their homes. They may need other, not only homeless services, but all the food and medicine and all types of other things that they may not have.
And then those that are able to escape the state and go to Texas end up changing the equation in terms of the amount of, housed population, but it really hasn't changed the equation on the unhoused. It has not. There has not been a lowering of real estate values. As you say, it's only increased, and thereby, and because people's income has not graduated in sync with the assessed value or the market value, there's this great disconnect here in this rather liberal state that is causing all this great inequity.
There's, I just read in the paper yesterday or today that said even though the population of the state is going down, it's not providing more housing opportunities for people who are here. I don't know how young people who are just getting started in life even manage to buy a home where in a county where the median sales price is almost $1 million.
Right. I mean, when I first got started in real estate, the first piece of property I bought in conjunction with some other friends was under, I think it was $68,000. $68,000. That isn't even a down payment these days.
One interesting point of comparison is we have a tax savings program called the homeowner's exemption. Anybody who owns a home and lives in it qualifies for it. It's not very much. It's a $7,000 exemption against your assessed value. So the total savings each year is probably only like $70.
Right.
At the time that it was that $7,000 exemption was first created in the early 1970s, the average median sales price of a home was like $35,000 or $40,000. So a $7,000 reduction on the assessment had a meaningful impact on your tax bill. The legislature has not raised that, and now that what used to be a meaningful savings is now enough money for a movie and a box of popcorn,
or maybe a good vacation.
$70?
Oh no, but the $7,000.
Oh, no, that's not your savings. That's the reduction from your assessed value. So if your home's $1 million and we reduce it for tax purposes to $993,000, you're not saving a lot of money. When the home prices were $34,000, $35,000, that $7,000 reduction in the assessment was actually a meaningful amount of money.
Right. So what's on your radar right now in terms of what you're trying to do in terms of changing state legislation and what you're trying to do in terms of reorganization of the department that you run.
Let me tell you an internal thing, and I want to talk about some things that are going on in Sacramento. The first thing I want to mention deals with our internal technology, and maybe it seems a bit in the weeds, but when I was elected in 2014, I inherited a department with a technology system that was built in the 1970s. It was a mainframe, green screen, DOS-based technology system.
Right.
We had to use a half a dozen different green screens that were all coded, not very robust in terms of the amount of information. The 2.5 million property files in LA County were each associated with a paper file.
Right.
Now, I've got 6 offices throughout the county. So if you were to call and want to talk about your property, I would have to refer you to one of those offices where your paper file was maintained. And somebody would have to get out of their chair and walk to this big cavernous room and find your file to talk about your property.
Right.
It was incredibly inefficient. It required that you talk to people. Training our employees how to read these green screens,
Right.
How to maintain them was very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought that was just untenable. So at the time, we launched a program. We're now in the final phase of that program. It's been going on since 2016. We have digitized all of our property files, hundreds of millions of papers. So it's now available to any of our employees online. We have moved off the mainframe. We're actually shutting the mainframe down this month. And we've moved to a cloud-based system. We've increased the amount of data which is available to the public and the county's open data website or on my website. It's improved efficiency for our employees. A lot of things that used to be paper-based are now done online, and it's providing tremendous value.
So let's wrap up with the state legislative initiatives that affect your job. What are the top 2?
So there's one piece of legislation that mercifully has stalled this year, and I hope it stays stalled. It was Assembly Constitutional Amendment 11, and it proposed to eliminate California's elected State Board of Equalization, which is like our state tax commission.
Right.
It's not very well understood. People don't really know a lot about it, but they played a pretty important role. And the fact that you have elected officials there are really helpful to assessors in doing our job. They tend to be much more responsive. They've got professional staff, and they're much more agile in responding to public need. This proposal would eliminate the Board of Equalization and move all the responsibilities to the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. And the problem I had with that is that if you think that the Department of Motor Vehicles or the California Unemployment Office are good examples on how government should work, then you should support eliminating the Board of Equalization. But if you don't think those are particularly good models and responsive and efficient, then you should.
Because basically what they were doing was consolidating the power of making those decisions all the way in Sacramento.
Yes.
Okay, which is kind of what they did when they started eliminating the municipal court system and making everything a superior court, and then running everything out of the state office of the Office of Judicial Government or whatever it is, and that has taken the judicial system out of the neighborhood and put the control of that centralized to state power. Now, what's the other one?
The other one, this is a current issue that's unresolved at the moment. So about 3 years ago, some state agencies came up with a way to try to provide workforce housing, moderate and median income housing. And they created these joint powers authorities, which enter into agreements with usually a private developer and a municipality, and they purchase apartment buildings and then lease them out to people who are income qualified. Yeah. And the theory behind it is because government property is exempt from taxation, they would pass along all these savings to their moderate income tenants. The problem is that they didn't do their due diligence. They didn't learn about what we began our conversation talking about, and that's possessory interest. And possessory interest says if you are a private entity using government property for private benefit, you have to pay the taxes that otherwise would be exempt for the government. Right. Joint powers authorities are government entities. The problem is that all those tenants who live in these units are beneficiaries of that project. Under the strict reading of the law, it's very clear, no assessor disagrees with this, those tenants are the possessory interest beneficiaries and have to be taxed. However, the administrators who put these deals together, these private developers, also meet the terms to be a possessory interest. So we're struggling right now. None of us want to send a tax bill to a tenant who's of a moderate income.
Right.
But that's what the law right now says we have to do. So we've been trying to get legislative response to write something to help us.
And it should be the developers of the property that are in partnership with a government entity that should be paying that tax.
I believe that to be the case. The challenge is that this is a very unique, singularly distinct arrangement, and the law does not specifically address it. So we're trying to figure that out. We don't want 6,000 tenants in LA County to have to suddenly get this possessory interest tax bill because their affordable housing will suddenly become unaffordable.
Right. Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Again, today we were talking with Jeffrey Prang, the Los Angeles County Assessor, and this is Random Lengths News, and I'm James Preston Allen. Thank you for being with us today. Jeffrey?
Thank you so much. This is great.
Great.